Everybody seems to be extremely worried about the crushing levels of inflation that have exploded around the world over the past year. But in a recent must-read report written by Deutsche Bank's global head of research, David Folkets-Landau, and co-authored by Peter Hooper and Jim Reed, the experts have shared an apocalyptic forecast and explained why the worst is yet to come. The report, titled Inflation, the Defining Macro Story of This Decade, highlights how the U.S. has seen the biggest shift in macro policies in nearly 40 years. The extraordinary spending policies are expanding the cracks of our economic system, which is now at risk to fall apart completely. The effects of this shift are being compounded by political turmoil in the United States and deeply worrying geopolitical risks, they wrote, revealing that, in turn, we are concerned that it will bring about uncomfortable levels of inflation. As the shift to a new expansionary monetary policy unfolds, economists and financial analysts have been unsure of just how much of what they understood about financial and macroeconomics is still valid. In a very short time span, these unconventional policies were put into place to allegedly prevent the economy from sliding into a devastating depression. But these measures had very little success in actually boosting growth. An immediate effect of the shift in macro policies is that the government and policymakers are losing the fear of letting inflation run, and they seem unbothered about our rising national debt. They've been justifying this major change in perspective as a necessary step to provide greater support to minority groups, as well as greater equality in income, wealth, education, medical care, and more broad-based economic opportunity and inclusion. However, what they're failing to see is that such policies are in fact making each of these issues significantly worse. The Deutsche Bank researchers argued that although a tighter social safety net is needed for the economic growth of our population and for our country, the administration's efforts to actually achieve a more balanced distribution of economic and political power between the corporate sector, labor, and the consumer seem quite ineffective, because even though the government is seemingly moving towards different priorities, central bankers must prioritize inflation. Indeed, history has shown that the social costs of significantly higher inflation and greatly expanded debt servicing obligations make it hard, if not impossible, to reach the social goals that the new U.S. administration is keen to achieve, outlined Folkets-Landau, noting that those who are the most economically vulnerable and disadvantaged will be hit first and hardest by mistakes in policy. To understand the proportions of the crisis we're about to face, it's important to keep in mind that today's paradigm shift in policy is rooted in the global financial crisis of 2008. It was during that period that financial and economic concerns focused on high and rising levels of sovereign debt. According to the researchers back then, market fears led governments to preemptively move towards fiscal consolidation before bond market vigilantes could force them. The effect of austerity was worsened as banks and consumers simultaneously tried to repair their balance sheets. Therefore, historically low interest rates and asset purchases have persisted regardless of the fact that economies were stagnant and inflation was at low levels. So way before the health outbreak spread across the globe, these measures were being increasingly questioned. But in face of such lower rates and manageable inflation levels, economists seem to have relaxed about the levels of debt that countries could sustain, particularly in the United States. When the virus health crisis burst in America early last year, this shift in thinking has been greatly accelerated. In a few short months, the U.S. national debt soared to levels unimaginable a decade ago, largely surpassing red line levels of 100% of GDP. But up until now, it appears that policymakers are not seriously concerned about debt sustainability in the long run and how it will affect investors, governments, or international institutions. The same goes for inflation, as the majority of central bankers and economists keep insisting that any rise in prices away from the historically low levels of the past decade will be transitory, relying on the assumption that baseline effects, one-offs, and structural forces will continue to suppress prices. Earlier this year, Janet Yellen affirmed that even though the country's debt burden was hitting record high levels, the passing of the latest $1.9 trillion relief package was necessary because, quote, with interest rates at historic lows, the smartest thing we can do is act big, unquote. Recently, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell acknowledged the imbalances caused by the many liquidity injections pumped into the economy over the past 18 months, but he continues to assert that those effects will soon go away. He said, during this time of reopening, we are likely to see some upward pressure on prices, but those pressures are likely to be temporary, as they are associated with the reopening process, he said. Their statements highlight that two of the biggest historic issues on macroeconomic policy, inflation and debt sustainability, are increasingly less seen as problematic. So, by removing the potential risks of higher inflation and debt levels, policymakers are essentially overlooking the severe consequences such new policies might bring about in favor of defending new goals for macro policy, which go far beyond simply stabilizing output across the business cycle, as explained by the Deutsche Bank experts. This changing approach to macro policy has been formalized in the Federal Reserve's operating procedures, making a broader interpretation of its mandate possible. Unlike in previous eras, when it was common practice to preempt inflation overshoots with higher rates, today's Fed has said they want to see actual progress, not just forecast progress. The new average inflation targeting approach only increases tolerance for inflation, the researchers wrote, stressing that we're headed to a new era of reckless monetary expansionism, and from now on, inflation levels will only move upward. Even more concerning is the fact that wherever the U.S. leads, other economies tend to follow. Even in Germany, with its reliable fiscal discipline, there's growing support to reform the constitutional debt brake in order to permit more deficit spending, Volkerts Landau revealed, adding that although in aggregate, the European Union's fiscal stimulus has been more limited than that seen in the United States, the arrival of the €750 billion recovery fund, financed by collective borrowing, potentially opens the way for further such packages in response to future crises. It's hard to see the ECB stepping back from helping to finance such fiscal investments in the continent or moves to promote further integration. In other words, as the United States moves towards looser positions regarding inflation levels and the entire world follows the same path, we're about to witness the most significant shift in global macro policy of the past 40 years, and that is incredibly concerning, since at this point fiscal injections are already off the charts. Never before have we seen such coordinated expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. This will continue as output moves above potential. This is why this time is different for inflation. Even if some of the transitory inflation ebbs away, we believe price growth will regain significant momentum as the economy overheats in 2022. Yet we worry that in its new inflation averaging framework, the Fed will be too slow to damp the rising inflation pressures effectively, the experts warned. As a result of the Fed's delay in assessing the tricky effects of inflation, Deutsche Bank forecasts that there will be huge disruptions of economic and financial activity in the coming months, and this will trigger a significant recession and set off a chain of financial distress around the world. The bank's apocalyptic projection takes into consideration historical data that proves that the Fed was not successful in achieving a soft landing when introducing a monetary tightening when inflation has been above 4%. That's why the researchers emphasize that policymakers are about to enter a far more difficult world than they've seen for several decades. In conclusion, Volkerts, Landau, Hooper, and Reed exposed that they worry that runaway inflation will make a comeback. The last time our economy was threatened by such painful levels of inflation was in the 1970s, the period marked by severe shortages, high unemployment levels, and soaring prices. However, few still remember the devastating impacts our society had to face during those times. And despite having new economic goals, no one, not even the U.S. government or the Fed Reserve, can suspend the most basic laws of economics, which means our explosive debt growth, largely financed by central banks, will result in similarly painful levels of inflation. We worry that the painful lessons of an inflationary past are being ignored by central bankers, either because they really believe that this time is different, or they've bought into a new paradigm that low interest rates are here to stay, or they're protecting their institutions by not trying to hold back a political steamroller. Whatever the reason, we expect inflationary pressures to re-emerge as the Fed continues with its policy of patience and its stated belief that current pressures are largely transitory, Deutsche Bank researchers projected. Pursuing social goals is a form of strengthening the economic foundations of any economy, but doing so by neglecting inflation leaves global economies sitting on a time bomb, the experts concluded. That is to say, deprioritizing inflation is the main issue the global economy must fight against, while at the same time coordinating expansionary fiscal and monetary policies across the world's leading economies is putting the entire globe in a dangerously vulnerable position. At some point, central bankers will be forced to act on inflation. When that finally happens, they'll find themselves in a very complicated, if not unsustainable, position. Policymakers have been bluntly assuming that the idea of huge levels of debt and runaway inflation is a small price to pay for achieving progressive political, economic, and social goals. However, soon enough it will become politically difficult for societies to cope with higher unemployment levels in order to fight inflation. Then, all of their social priorities will have to be put aside if inflation returns in earnest. Meanwhile, the price of everything will shoot up and affect our entire population. Of course, the effects are going to be catastrophic. In short, this means that this new shift in macro policy is actually having the opposite effect when it comes to supporting social goals. Unfortunately, when we hit the stage of unsustainable inflation levels, central banks will become so overwhelmed with the imbalances of their policies that policymakers will have to suspend all social programs that actually provide a safety net for those in need. They won't be able to come to bail us out. We will witness a calamitous uptick in poverty and unemployment rates, as well as even more severe shortages and even higher price increases. At the end of the day, the social progress our societies need will be further and further away from our reach. As the Deutsche Bank specialists underscored, Low, stable inflation and historically low interest rates have been the glue that have held together macro policy for the last 3 decades. But now that this page has been turned, and we've been persistently moving towards a new monetary era, Americans are about to face the most challenging years in history, and the collapse has just begun.